Okay, so today is the last day we're going to be spending on Candide, so we'll do some summing up, when we get to that. But I do want you to note that for next time, right, you're reading the first part of Rousseau's On the Social Contract. Right? We'll be spending 4 sessions on this. It's conveniently broken up into four short sections, right? The first section is only about 15 pages long, but it's going to be a different experience reading Rousseau and reading Voltaire, because even though they're engaging with some of the same ideas, right? Voltaire is dealing with these ideas by, writing a story about them. Rousseau is writing a work of political philosophy, right? So there isn't going to be any kind of narrative to follow. There's no story. However, you can still do the same kind of analysis we have been doing, right? So, look for ideas or, word strands that seem to repeat, right? Look for things that Rousseau seems to oppose to each other. And, even kind of like look for, even maybe particular blind spots or biases in his reasoning, right? So you're going to be doing a free write on that as well. And let me also show you the stuff that I've got on Georgia View for you to help you understand the context in which Rousseau is writing. And wait. Okay, so if you go to Georgia View, once the content browser loads up, you see I've got a folder here for Rousseau on the Social Contract. Right, and if you go to that folder, I have two BBC podcasts here, right? One is about Rousseau generally, right? And the other is about social contract theory generally. So these two together should help you get a good sense of where Rousseau is coming from and what he's trying to do. I've also got these articles from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on social contract theory, and also on 3 of the thinkers that Rousseau is directly in dialogue with in this book, right? So he directly references the work of Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Hugo Grotius. So it might be a good idea for you to, because the footnotes in this edition aren't really very good or very useful, it's probably a good idea for you guys to maybe check these out and familiarize yourselves a little bit with what these guys argued about social contracts, what they are, how they work, right? Okay, so does anybody have any questions about homework or about stuff that's coming up? Okay. Then let's get back into Candide. So I did say we're going to try to, sum up our thoughts about the development by the end of this class. But since this is your last day with this, what did you all think of this book on the whole?
It wasn't as hard as you said it was going to be.
Okay.
The context. It's just like some of the context is a little.
Okay, yeah, and there's a lot of stuff in it that is very much kind of of its particular time, right? That maybe is a little bit hard, in the 21st century for us to grapple with, right? But yeah, okay, so it wasn't as hard as you thought it was going to be. That's good. What other thoughts do y'all have about this? What do you think the main argument of the book is? If there's any point to prove here, what do you think it is?
Getting out of Tim Trump.
What's that?
Get out of Tim Trump.
Yeah, get out of Thunder Ten Trump, right? Okay, good. But I think think that that is actually, that's a smart and valid response, right? Why do we, what does Thunder Ten Tronc seem to represent for Voltaire? Like, what kind of place does it represent? Why would one need to get out of it? What's wrong with it?
It's not evolving. It's the same thing.
Okay, yeah, it's stagnant, right? Yeah, good. And what might be some of the reasons why a place like Thunder Ten Tronc is stagnant? Why doesn't it evolve?
Because the people all believe the same thing. That it's
Okay.
probably the best possible way.
Yeah, okay, there's no difference of opinion, right? Just like in El Dorado, even though El Dorado is good and Thunder Ten Tronc is, right? Yeah, there's no difference of opinion. Everybody agrees with the Baron. Because if they don't, they get a kick on the backside and are sent away, right? And what else might be wrong with a place like Thunder Ten Tronc? Like, how does it get to be like this, to be the stagnant place where everybody just agrees with what the authority figure says? What's its relationship with the outside world?
There's none.
Yeah, there isn't one, right? It's completely cut off from every place else. So it is what we call, in negative terms, provincial, right? It's cut off from other places and kind of wrapped up in its own little bubble, right? Its own little world. So yeah, so I think that this is a good way to sum up parts of the argument of Candide, right? You need to get out of whatever Thunder Ten Tronc you are living in if you want your own worldview to evolve, right? To accurately reflect events in the world, right? Might there be other arguments that the novella seems to be making? What other points might we draw from this? Excuse me a second. Seem to develop a drinking problem. Okay. So what other points might we pull out of this? They might even be things that are kind of related to this, right?
Experience is knowledge.
Okay. And where would we get that from, Jennifer?
Well, because of Candide. At first, he believed what Pangloss had told him.
Uh-huh.
But then as the book continued, he kind of stopped believing it, and then he started questioning.
Yeah. His experience teaches him that the world is not the way Pangloss painted it to him, right? And where does all of Pangloss's supposed knowledge come from?
Just theory.
Yeah. Pangloss only knows theory. So a philosophy that's based on this kind of optimism, or capital O optimism, not like the lowercase o optimism that we're used to, can only be based in theory, right? Because you can't possibly believe that this is the best of all possible worlds if you've actually traveled in it, right? So yeah, so experience is key to knowledge. All right, good. Any other arguments that seems to be making here about, maybe arguments about society? Think about like what ranks of society, for example, Voltaire seems to be most and least sympathetic towards.
You said something like social status matters, or like social status or something like that.
Okay.
They do matter because in the book
Mm-hmm.
they was favoring well, they didn't really like the Catholics when Candide didn't like the Catholics.
Okay.
And they was favoring all the people of the church more than others.
Okay, yeah. So, there is something going on here with a kind of attitude towards the church, right? And does Voltaire's attitude towards the church seem to be a positive one or a negative one? Does he seem to like them or dislike them? Yeah, he seems to dislike them, right? What seems to be his attitude towards the church? What does he think of them? How can we tell he has a problem with them?
The church doesn't allow other people to have their own opinions.
Yeah, the first time we see the church really acting here, right? It's the Inquisition capturing Pangloss and torturing and hanging him for expressing his opinions, right? So he seems to regard the church as narrow-minded, right? And also as oppressive. And let's also think about, like, why are they having these, why are they burning all of these heretics in the first place in Lisbon? Why is the church burning all of these people? What do they think it's going to do?
So personal.
Yeah, if we burn enough heretics, right? We round up all the sinners and we burn, then that will please God and we will have no more earthquakes, right?
But they still had it.
Still have an earthquake, right? Because things don't work this way, right? So in addition to being narrow-minded and oppressive, he also paints them as superstitious, right? As believing things they have no good reason to believe, right? It's kind of like magical thinking, right? What other segments of society do we see criticized here? Particularly for thinking about this like in terms of social class. So do y'all remember the three estates theory thing from last time? Okay, and the first estate was
It was started with O.
oratores, and they were,
Laboratories.
pardon?
Church.
Yeah, the church is the oratores, right? Those who pray. And then the second estate is
Laboratories.
the nobility, right? Yes. So what seems to be his attitude towards the nobility? How do we generally see the nobility behaving?
Like they have all the power.
What's that?
Like they have all the power.
Okay. Yeah, so also oppressive, right? So they seem to have that in common with the church. And what else? Let's like think about the activities of certain noble characters in the novel, right? What is Cunegonde's brother like, for example? Right, he's kind of straddling both worlds there. He's a Jesuit, so he's part of the church, but he's also a noble. He's the heir to the barony. What's the big issue that he and Candide have with each other? Yeah, he doesn't want Candide to marry his sister, right? And why can Candide not marry his sister?
Because he got two titles or something.
Yeah, he doesn't have enough, right? He's not quite noble enough to marry Cunegonde, right? So the nobility are depicted as oppressive, as snobbish, and elitist. And obsessed with basically bullshit, right? Right, Candide says to the Baron, right, it's like, well, Pangloss taught me that, all men are equal. And, in theory, sure, right? But not all people are treated equally in the world, right? And it's largely because of people like the young Baron, right? So, what kind of picture of society are we getting here? Right? Like, how does Voltaire seem to feel about, like, if we think about this as reflecting France in the middle of the 18th century, right? What kind of picture is Voltaire giving us of his country at his moment of time? What does he seem to think about how things are going?
Stagnant on the
Yeah, okay, you've got a society that's still mired in the Middle Ages, right? Where, the church and the barons still lord it over everybody. Where the people are narrow-minded, where public opinion is censored, right? Where people aren't free to speak their minds. And so yeah, it's not a very pleasant picture, right? So let's try to think about here what the positive alternative is, or whether Candide gives us a positive alternative to this. Do you think that this does give us a way out?
Right. Well,
if it gives us a way out of living like this, does Voltaire seem to believe society has to look like this? Okay, why not? How can we tell he doesn't think society has to look like this?
because of how he used Candide to explore going to El Dorado.
Okay, so El Dorado does present an alternative, right? Things are definitely better in El Dorado.
It's kind of the same, but it's better.
Yeah. It is also kind of the same though, right? You do have, the fact that everyone agrees and that nobody leaves and society's basically stagnant, right? But at least people are nicer to each other and, nobody burns anyone at the stake. So you do have a more, so El Dorado gives us a more positive vision of this, right? But it's still in some ways fundamentally the same. What about, I kind of want to think about here the last sentence of the novel here, or really kind of the last two paragraphs here, right? Let's actually just kind of look at the last page. Can I turn to page 87, and can one of you start reading from us from, I know also said Candide that we must cultivate our garden.
I know also said Candide that we must cultivate our garden. You are right, said Pangloss. For when man was first placed in the Garden of Eden, he was put there.
Ut operator eum.
Ut operator eum, that he might cultivate it, which shows that man was not born to be idle. Let us work, said Martin, without disputing it is the only way to render life tolerable. The whole little, oh wait, let's keep going.
Yep, keep going, yep.
The whole little society enter into this laudable design
Mhm.
according to their different abilities. Their little plot of land produced plentiful crops. Candide was indeed very ugly, but she became an excellent pastry cook. Her quick work and embroidery, the old woman looked after the linen. They were all not expecting fragmentary of some service or other, for he made a good joiner and became a very earnest man. Pangloss sometimes said to Candide, there is a
Concatenation.
concatenation of events in this best of all possible words. For if you had not been kicked out of the magnificent castle for love of Miss Candide, if you had not been put into the Inquisition, if you had not walked on America, if you had not stabbed the bear, if you had not lost all your sheep from the fine country of El Dorado, you would not be here eating preserved citrons and pistachio nuts. All that is very well, answered Candide, but let us cultivate our garden.
Okay, thank you. So, what does this little society that Candide and his friends build in Constantinople look like? Well, there's a couple of points here. A joiner is a carpenter. So Friar Giroflée becomes a good carpenter. What's this look like, and how is it different from everything that Candide and his friends have experienced thus far?
They realized that optimism is running out.
What's that?
I said they realized optimism is running out.
Okay. Particularly Pangloss's species of optimism, right? Now, if we look at what Pangloss says here to Candide, right? This chain of events. He says, if you had not been kicked out of a magnificent castle for love of Miss Cunegonde, if you had not been put into the Inquisition, if you had not walked all over America, if you had not stabbed the Baron, if you had not lost all your sheep from the fine country of El Dorado, you would not be here eating preserved citrons and pistachio nuts, right? So you wouldn't be living this good life you are now if you hadn't suffered all of these terrible things along the way, right? So what is Pangloss still trying to do?
He's still trying to show that there's good with the man.
Yeah, or that everything bad leads to something good, right? So he's still trying to rationalize all of their experiences as fitting into this best of all possible worlds model, right? Does Candide care anymore?
Not really.
He doesn't even bother to argue with him now, right? What's his response? What does he say instead?
All that is very well.
Yep, all that is very well, but
Let us cultivate our garden.
yes, let us cultivate our garden. So this is this is kind of interesting for a novel that is so anti the church as an institution, right? Although it does show individual Christian believers as good people, right? James the Anabaptist, for example, is a good person. But this is a reference to the book of Genesis, chapter 3, verse 23. When Adam and Eve are expelled from the garden for eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge, they're told that they are going to have to till the earth, right? That's what that un operator eum means, right? It means literally that he might cultivate it, right? They're going to have to go out into the world and work for their bread. And that kind of resembles the plot of the novel, right? That Candide is expelled from this Eden that's not really much of an Eden anyway. It's not so good, nothing ever happens, right? And he's expelled because he got a little too much knowledge of Miss Cunegonde, right? So now that they're out, they have to cultivate their garden. Right? What do you think that means? That we must cultivate our garden?
Make a better society.
Okay, that you can make a better society, right? But what do you have to do in order to do that?
Everyone has to be willing to work for it.
Yeah. Right, to cultivate requires, I can't talk today either, requires work.
So really,
Go ahead.
the book Pangloss Philosophy or Theory was right. They just had to see it for themselves. Honestly. That's what it seemed like.
Well, let's kind of back up though and think about what Pangloss's philosophy actually argues, right? So on the one hand, yeah, like Candide actually does have it pretty good now, right? But does he have it pretty good because the world is designed to bring him to a good end? Or because he's worked for this?
Because he worked for it.
Because he worked for it, right? And Pangloss's actual philosophy basically encourages you to just sit back and enjoy, right? Because we live in the best of all possible worlds anyway, so you can't possibly actually change anything, right? So if we actually follow Pangloss's philosophy the way he spells it out, it encourages us to be passive. And the difference here at the end of the novella, right, is that Candide is encouraging us to be active, right? To go out and to cultivate and to stop theorizing, right? Learn a skill, work your garden. And this, by the way, is also kind of, this idea of learning a skill is kind of a big issue in 18th century France, right? So one of the things we're going to talk about as we talk about the run-up to the Revolution is the publication of a book called the Encyclopedia, which is exactly what it sounds like, right? It's an encyclopedia. And what its authors intended to do was spread what had been kind of closely guarded professional knowledge and craft knowledge that had been guarded by academics or by the church or by guilds, right? And to distribute that knowledge freely among ordinary people, which is why they were sent to jail and their books were seized, right? So this whole idea of work is also kind of caught up with larger currents about the spread of ideas and the spread of knowledge and the democratization of knowledge, right? That knowledge is for everybody, or ought to be for everybody. And not just for the church or for university professors or for craft guilds or people like that, right? So that was a very long-winded way of answering your question, but I think that it still ends with the critique of Pangloss's philosophy and Martin's philosophy, right? Because they both encourage you to be passive. Martin doesn't think anything can be better, so why try? Pangloss thinks everything is already great, so why try? So optimism and so that kind of push and pull between optimism and pessimism is one of the key binaries that we see holding the novella together. Right? Do you see other binary pairs running through this? Like, are there other kind of like opposed, like ideas that seem to be opposed to each other in a similar kind of way? What about something like freedom versus oppression. Even in the optimism-pessimism thing, we could probably think about two ways of getting knowledge that are opposed to each other as a kind of binary, right? As kind of represented by Pangloss and Martin, right? Where does all of Martin's knowledge come from? If Pangloss is all theory, what is Martin?
From his suffering.
Pardon?
From his suffering.
Yeah, it's from his experience, right? Experience has taught Martin that the world is a shitty place, right? Where bad things constantly happen. So that we can also set up, a theory versus experience binary, right? Yeah, go. Were you about to say something?
Oh, no.
So when we notice these kinds of opposed pairs in the narrative, right? The thing that we generally want to try to do is think about which side, if either, right, the novel seems to be coming down on, and why. And I think with most of these, the answer is fairly obvious, right? The optimism and pessimism, does it seem to come down firmly on either side of this? Yeah, it ends up kind of hedging a little bit, right? That, while the optimists are completely misguided, right? And the pessimists sometimes have a point. What we end up with is actually something more like a kind of guarded, productive optimism, right? That's rooted more in experience and action. Like, if we want a better world, we have to work for it. Rather than the passivity of both of these systems. And I think in terms of freedom versus oppression, there's a clear winner, right? Yeah. Definitely on the side of freedom, right? Especially freedom of expression, right? Because Voltaire seems to want to allow people to express their opinions, even if he thinks those opinions are dumb, right? Theory versus experience might be a little bit harder, and I think there are other binaries at work here too. These are just a couple that we might work with, right? What I want you guys thinking about is if you had to write a longer paper about this, right? Some of the kinds of things, some of the ideas you might organize it around, right? And this might be one to try to think about. So, like, what kinds of knowledge in the novella are based on theory? What kinds are based on experience, right? So we already know that Pangloss's, capital O optimism is theoretical, right? And indeed, like, one of his defenses of his worldview, in the final chapter, is that Leibniz couldn't possibly be wrong. I mean, look at that guy's wig. What other groups or individuals in the novella are completely reliant on theory? As the guiding force of their worldview or their belief system. Okay, and why would you say the Baron's worldview is rooted in theory?
Because of Thunder Two Trump.
Okay, yeah.
How he works in society.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It's based on it's based on a medieval theory, right, of how society is supposed to run and function, right? Which is by 1759 completely outdated. But yeah, the Baron is also arguably running on theory, right? So the whole notion of an aristocracy, right? That you need this elite group that's obsessed with how many family connections people have, right? How many connections to other noble families people have. But yeah, what that is itself based in theory rather than experience. And what about people who believe that burning sinners stops earthquakes?
Catholic Church.
Yeah, the Church and the Inquisition here too, right? I mean, like that's superstitions are based entirely in theory rather than knowledge, than experiential knowledge, right? A way you think the world works rather than a way you've actually observed the world working. Yeah, so it seems that most of the forces that Voltaire doesn't like, right, end up on the theory side of the binary. Now, in terms of the experience side, what would we put over there? Where do we see characters or groups getting their knowledge from experience?
The old woman.
Pardon?
The old woman.
Okay, the old woman. Yeah, she has suffered, right? And had a buttock cut off. And tends to give fairly pragmatic advice as a result, right? Like telling Cunegunda in particular, like, look, do what you have to survive right now, right? Rather than what you would do in some ideal world. Is there a counterpart who works for or with Candide?
Are you talking about Cacambo?
Yeah, Cacambo, right? Yeah. Would Candide have survived a minute in South America without Cacambo? No, because Cacambo has actually lived and traveled and experienced things, right? And so he knows the world in a way that Candide doesn't.
Martin.
What's that?
Martin.
Martin also is experienced, right? And I think while his pessimism in the end is critiqued, right? He also teaches Candide a lot of important things. And seems to be more like the novel seems, I think the novella seems to regard Martin as more right than Pangloss is. But at least Martin has reasons to believe what he believes, right? So yeah, I think one thing that you could do if you were so inclined is sort of pull out this theory experience binary and make an argument about how this divide resolves itself into this last statement about cultivating your garden. Now there is also, there's a character I wanted to talk about today whom we haven't discussed yet, so for today's reading. This guy, the senator in Venice, Pococurante. What did you think of Candide, this chapter in which Candide and Martin visit this senator? What's this guy like? His name, by the way, in Latin means indifferent or uncaring. Why do they want to go see this guy in the first place? If you look on page 69, Candide and Martin are conversing. As people talk, said Candide, of the Senator Pococurante, who lives in that fine palace on the Brenta, where he entertains foreigners in the politest manner. They pretend that this man has never felt any uneasiness. I should be glad to see such a rarity, said Martin. Candide immediately sent to ask the Lord Pococurante permission to wait upon him the next day. And when we actually see the meeting they have with this guy, is it true that he's never felt any uneasiness? Does that seem to be more or less correct? Does the Senator Pococurante seem to feel much of anything? Let's just go through this together and see if we can detect a pattern in the senator's responses to the world, right? So on page 70, right? First, two pretty girls, very neatly dressed, served them with chocolate, which was frothed exceedingly well. Candide could not refrain from commending their beauty, grace, and address. They are good enough creatures, said the senator. I make them lie with me sometimes, for I am very tired of the ladies of the town, of their coquetries, of their jealousies, of their quarrels, of their humors, of their pettinesses, of their prides, of their follies, and of the sonnets which one must make or have made for them. But after all, these two girls begin to weary me. Now, one reason to stick a pin in this is that it also points to, there's a larger theme of sexual exploitation of women throughout the novella as well, right? That, Cunegonde in particular is exploited by the Inquisitor and Don Issachar, and then by the governor of Buenos Aires, and lots of people, right? So this is maybe something a little comparable to that. But let's just kind of go through some of the rest of this here. After breakfast, Candide, walking into a long gallery, was surprised by the beautiful pictures. He asked, by what master were the two first? They are by Raphael, said the senator. I bought them at a great price out of vanity some years ago. They are said to be the finest things in Italy, but they do not please me at all. The colors are too dark, the figures are not sufficiently rounded, nor in good relief. The draperies in no way resemble stuffs. In a word, whatever may be said, I do not find there a true imitation of nature. I only care for a picture when I think I see nature itself, and there are none of this sort. I have a great many pictures, but I prize them very little. While they were waiting for dinner, Pococurante ordered a concert. Candide found the music delicious. This noise, said the senator, may amuse one for half an hour, but if it were to last longer, it would grow tiresome to everybody, though they durst not own it. Music today is only the art of executing difficult things, and that which is only difficult cannot please long. Perhaps I should be fonder of the opera if they had not found the secret of making it a monster which shocks me. Let who will go to see bad tragedies set to music, where the scenes are contrived for no other end than to introduce 2 or 3 songs ridiculously out of place to show off an actress's voice. Let who will, or who can, die away with pleasure at the sight of an eunuch quavering the role of Caesar or of Cato, and strutting awkwardly upon the stage. For my part, I have long since renounced those paltry entertainments which constitute the glory of modern Italy and are purchased so dearly by sovereigns. So, what do we notice about Pococurante and his tastes?
Very fine taste. He's of the elitist.
Okay, yeah. He's so elitist, right? Can anything actually please him? Nothing does, right? The best food doesn't please him. The best paintings don't please him. The best Music and theater don't please him, right? The best books don't please him. So he has all of this stuff. Which he's purchased. For what reason? Why did he buy these paintings by Raphael if he doesn't like them? Why does he buy these, beautiful manuscript editions of Homer if he doesn't read them or enjoy them?
Just so he can.
Yeah. It's like, I don't know, have either of you ever seen the movie Anchorman?
Who?
Anchorman, the Will Ferrell movie? No? Oh wait, my references are getting ridiculously out of date. There's a scene near the beginning of the movie where, this ridiculous character, Ron Burgundy, who's, supposed to be a big deal in San Diego, as the local news anchor, is trying to impress this woman he meets by saying, it's like, I'm a very important man, I own many leather-bound books, right? Now, if you own leather-bound books, do you own them because you intend to read them?
For decoration.
Exactly, you're showing off, right? So he owns these things basically to show off, right? But does he seem to take any pleasure even in showing them off? Yeah, so this guy is so over-cultivated, right? That nothing can make him happy. He's got so much education and he's steeped in so much art that he shows his superiority to all of it by disdaining it, right? By just kind of constantly crapping on it. And Candide is having honest responses to all of these things. It's, oh wow, what a great painting, right? Oh hey, I really like this music, right? Wow, look at all these great books you've got. But Pococurante keeps trying to prove his superiority to someone like Candide by shitting on everything Candide says he likes, right? It's like, oh yes, how it all bores me. So what do you think is the purpose of this little episode? Why do they pay this visit to this character? In the larger context of some of these arguments we've been talking about in the novella, what's the point of this visit to Pococurante?
To see if he really feel uneasy about anything.
Okay, and he doesn't, right? He's really never been uneasy, but it's because he's never been anything but bored, right? So, how might this fit into some of these like theory versus experience, or optimism, pessimism, or freedom, oppression binaries we've been talking about?
Pococurante probably go in experience.
Yeah. He's experienced, right? At least within this particular realm. But his experience hasn't taught him anything useful, right? At least each of these other three characters that we've associated with experience have learned something useful from the bad things that have happened to them, right? Has anything actually bad ever happened to Pococurante, as far as we can tell?
If it is, he caused.
Yeah, I mean, the guy's life seems pretty easy, right? And maybe because his experience is limited to one particular realm, right? His whole experience is limited to the world of art, right? And about which he is deeply knowledgeable, even though he hates it all. So I'm thinking that what we might have in somebody like Pococurante is an argument for another binary here, right? The difference between, a generalist who goes out and, learns from experiences of various kinds, right? And a specialist who keeps their knowledge and their experience focused to one relatively small sphere. And the specialist doesn't seem to come out looking very good here, or very happy. I think also there's, we can probably tie this back again, this whole thing about the garden, right? Because when all of Candide's companions find their particular calling, right, their particular task that they're good at, let's look at kind of what sorts of things they learn, right? Cunegonde became an excellent pastry cook. Paquette worked at embroidery. The old woman looked after linen. Friar Giroflée became a carpenter, right? And they're all working, basically to grow vegetables as well. So what kinds of work does Voltaire seem to think actually bring people joy and pleasure and meaning?
Work done for other people.
Okay, yeah, work done for other people. Does it seem to prefer physical work or intellectual work?
Physical.
Yeah, physical labor is favored here over, the so-called life of the mind, right? Right, they're only happy once they give up philosophizing and just get down to work, right? So for a philosophical novel, right, that seems to be a weird kind of point to be making. And I'm not really quite sure what to do with that. What I'm hoping we've done here is we've kind of drawn out enough kind of themes and binaries for y'all to think about that you might be able to explore in a short paper, right? So I want y'all to keep thinking about this stuff. See what you can do with it, right? See how far you can take it. And then let me give you the reading questions for Rousseau for next time. Rousseau is going to be concerned with some of the same stuff, though he might be taking a different direction. Voltaire and Rousseau actually hated each other. They knew one another, they had a lot of the same friends, but they could not stand one another.